Hello, my name is Kelsey, and I am a PhD student in sociology at the University of Victoria. Today, I will be presenting on my master's research, which is also a forthcoming publication in the journal Studies in Religion. My project is titled Complicit Silence, Fluid Identities, and a Shift to Personalized Faith, LGBTQ plus Experiences in Christian Communities. There is no conflict of interest to report for this project. Before getting into the project, I just want to address my positionality in regards to this topic. I was raised as a Christian and identified as a Christian for a majority of my life. This community that I was raised in was comprised of my family, friends, church, and schooling. My experiences as a queer person growing up in a Christian community and my attempts to understand these experiences through a sociological lens largely served as the inspiration for this current project. Therefore, my positionality is inextricably linked to both the research process and the findings presented here. I also want to provide some brief context regarding LGBTQ plus individuals and issues within Christian communities to situate my research. Historically, institutional religion has been used as a mechanism for heterosexist intolerance and oppression towards homosexuality specifically, as well as other non-normative genders and sexualities. Despite increased tolerance from many denominations, there remains a lack of acceptance of LGBTQ plus individuals in major religious institutions, and many organizations have not fundamentally altered their viewpoint that LGBTQ plus individuals go against their moral code. The role that religious faith plays in individuals' lives can be very important, often providing emotional and social support, as well as shaping an individual's worldview. However, individuals who identify as LGBTQ plus within Christian communities face a unique set of challenges in not only attempting to integrate their faith and gender or sexual identities, but also in attempting to exist as full members of the community while professing an identity that is often viewed as sinful. These doctrines that condemn homosexuality constitute the ideological backdrop against which those in Christian communities initially experience their LGBTQ plus identity. At worst, they are seen as irredeemable sinners. At best, they suffer from problems or afflictions. Sexual minority religiosity has been found to serve as both a developmental asset and a source of risk for sexual minority individuals, demonstrating a clear need to examine these topics in more depth to better understand these complex relationships between LGBTQ plus individuals, their faiths, and their faith communities. Significantly, there is a lack of Canadian context in current research on this topic. This project works to address this gap by presenting the experiences of LGBTQ plus individuals in Christian communities in British Columbia and Alberta. My project also highlights the existence of a strong cisgender norm in these communities, which has not been examined extensively in previous research. This research is predicated on 3 research questions. 1, how do LGBTQ plus individuals understand their LGBTQ plus identity when situated within a traditionally heteronormative religious community? Does there continue to be a code of silence surrounding LGBTQ plus identities within Christian communities? And how do these individuals deal with the perceived incompatibility between their faith and their sexuality and/or gender? This study utilizes queer theory to frame the experiences of LGBTQ plus individuals in Christian communities. Queer theory moves beyond exploring sexual orientation, gender, and religion in isolation, and instead considers the way that religious identity interplays with sexual and gender identity in a way that simultaneously produces a context of empowerment and disempowerment. This study also utilizes the concept of liminality. Liminality can be defined as a state of being in between. One who is in a liminal state does not have a place in the social structure and is left feeling like they don't belong. By inhabiting this liminal space, sexual minority religiosity can serve as both a developmental asset and as a source of risk for sexual minority individuals, and holds the potential for social change. I also use the concepts of sacramental shame and coming out as confession in this project, coined by Moon and Tobin and Anderson, respectively. Sacramental shame is a ritualized, spiritualized form of shame that both grows out of and serves to protect fundamentalist Christian theologies. And when internalized, it prevents LGBTQ plus individuals from embodying their LGBTQ plus identities. People in these communities often dispense this shame, believing it will help their loved ones to conform to God's will. However, it instead tends to ground the recognition of personhood in a particular binary understanding of gender and sexuality. This concept is complemented by Anderson's concept of coming out as confession. Anderson argues that the act of coming out by LGBTQ plus individuals in these religious contexts is perceived by those within the religious community as a public confession of sin and guilt. This then relegates LGBTQ plus individuals who are out to an inferior position within the ideology of God's created order, in that cisgender heterosexuals are seen as created more in the image of God than those with non-normative genders and sexualities. For this project, I used snowball sampling, starting with my personal connections, as this is often a stigmatized population within traditional Christian contexts. In order to participate in this study, participants had to not identify as both cisgender and heterosexual. They had to have been part of an evangelical or Protestant Christian community in Canada for a minimum of 6 months and within the last 8 years, and they had to be between the ages of 19 and 35. I ended up with 6 participants from British Columbia and Alberta. Participants used a variety of diverse labels to describe their sexual and gender identities, including bisexual, cisgender, gender void, genderqueer, gender fluid, questioning, agender, non-binary, queer, asexual, aromantic, transfeminine, transmasculine, and gay. They also participated in a variety of different Christian communities and denominations, including Mennonite Brethren, Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, Mennonite Christian, Pentecostal, Baptist, and non-denominational. These Christian communities often comprise the participants' family, church, school, and friend groups. I conducted semi-structured interviews, in-depth interviews with each participant over Zoom. Interviews ranged from 45 minutes to an hour and a half in length. They were recorded and transcribed verbatim, and all participants were assigned pseudonyms. Any identifying characteristics were excluded. The transcripts were analyzed with in vivo software, using thematic analysis to identify codes, themes, and categories, and I used a hierarchical coding process where every code developed during my analysis of the data was necessarily present in the transcripts before I connected it to broader themes in the existing literature. Throughout this process, I utilized queer theory to inform my research and to sensitize myself to particular elements of participants' experiences, with a focus on not predetermining the meaning of those experiences. Findings and discussion. The findings for this project are split up into 5 broad categories, with more specific subsections when necessary. Participants talked about the cisgender heterosexual norm that was present within their various Christian communities. They discussed their community's responses to non-normative genders and sexualities, which included silence on LGBTQ plus identities, framing LGBTQ plus identities as sinful or shameful, explicit hate towards these identities, different responses to non-normative sexuality compared to non-normative gender, the ways these norms are changing over time, and how some people in these communities are just repeating the rhetoric they have been taught and told. This impacted participants in a variety of ways, including a lack of education, language, and exposure regarding LGBTQ plus individuals and issues, mental health issues, a lack of formal support for LGBTQ plus individuals from the community, and a loss of that sense of community. Participants also described their current religious identities, and they provided recommendations for change in these communities, which I will touch on more at the end of this presentation. These findings resulted in 3 main discussion points that address my 3 research questions. First, the results from my study indicate that there does continue to be a code of silence within some Christian communities in British Columbia and Alberta. Participants viewed the silence surrounding LGBTQ plus identities and issues and the subsequent lack of formal support, especially from leadership and more formal structures in the community, as upholding cis and heteronormative ideals, and as complicit in perpetuating rhetoric that LGBTQ plus identities are abnormal, sinful, and shameful. Moon and Tobin argue that in these communities, one's ability to be recognized as a person created by God actually depends on one's ability to be recognized within the gender binary. And not being recognized within this binary calls into question the individual's personhood. This ultimately becomes an instrument of oppression, and participants' reported experiences in my study demonstrated that this both grows out of and serves to protect theologies that ground the recognition of personhood in a particular binary understanding of both gender and sexuality. I argue that this complicit silence and the implicit assumption that being LGBTQ+ is sinful frames the act of coming out in these communities as a public confession of sin and guilt, and coerces LGBTQ+ individuals to stay in the closet and avoid discussing their struggles. Meanwhile, the Christian communities are able to maintain a quote-unquote neutral stance on the topic and avoid any consequences associated with taking a side. Second, my findings indicate that LGBTQ+ individuals in Christian communities may shift to a personalized and individualized version of the faith they were raised in. The participants in my study view Christianity and Christian communities as a resource or option for them to take advantage of, but not necessarily as a requirement in their lives. They were able to pick and choose which aspects of the Christian faith and teachings they wanted to continue embracing, and they discarded the aspects of Christianity that conflicted with their LGBTQ+ identities. However, participants reported feeling a significant sense of loss of their community as they distanced themselves from these communities, which many continue to miss today. Third, my findings indicate that some LGBTQ+ individuals in Christian communities understand both their LGBTQ+ identities and religious identities in fluid and liminal terms. All participants except one described their gender or sexual identity in fluid terms, with the potential and openness to change the labels they are using in the future if they themselves change, or if they find a label that better describes themselves. Some participants also describe their sexual or gender identity as liminal, and that how they identify often depends on the context, who they are talking to, and how comfortable and trusting the participant feels with them. All participants also described their religious identities as fluid, and many described them as occupying a liminal space in that they identify as a Christian or not, depending on the context, and they embrace some Christian teachings and reject others. However, one participant noted that outwardly embracing fluid and liminal identities in these communities that value stability and fixed identities can have negative consequences for individuals who identify as LGBTQ+. Recommendations to improve the way these communities address sexual and gender diversity include exposure to LGBTQ+ individuals and issues, celebration of LGBTQ+ identities, adherence to unconditional love as a core tenet of Christianity, and transparency regarding community stances on LGBTQ+ individuals and issues. Additionally, participants pointed to a strong need for formal supports, specifically for LGBTQ+ individuals in these communities, in an environment that is safe, welcoming, confidential, and non-judgmental. In terms of limitations, I came into this project with my own experiences of being an LGBTQ+ person in a Christian community, which may have influenced the areas that I chose to focus on and how I chose to present the data from this project. My project is limited in that the sample size is small and not representative of the larger population, and due to my recruitment methods, there are likely volunteer biases present in the sample. In order to protect the participants' identities, I did not collect any demographic information other than what I deemed directly relevant to the research topic, so gender, sexuality, and religious identity. Therefore, this project is unable to address the intersections of gender or sexual identity and religious identity with other social sectors, such as race or class. In future research, I recommend that researchers keep in mind the latent functions of the silence surrounding LGBTQ+ individuals and issues in many of these communities, and consider probing deeper below the surface to examine the ways it can support the oppression and marginalization of non-normative identities. Additionally, I recommend that future researchers take the tendency towards fluidity and liminality that my participants emphasized into account when researching sexual and gender minority individuals, and when examining the ways these individuals resolve conflict and attempt to integrate seemingly contradictory identities. Ultimately, my hope is that this work can provide some general guidance for Christian communities on how to respectfully address LGBTQ+ identities and issues within their communities, and that it will begin to open a dialogue between Christian communities and their LGBTQ+ members, and encourage these communities to listen to, unconditionally love, and better support those with non-normative genders and sexualities in their midst. Thank you for listening.